Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Appropriations Committee Chairman Ben Barnes, I want to welcome everyone to today's budget hearing. Today we have two agencies who will be presenting. First, we have public debt, and our budget analyst is Mr. Patrick Frank. Thank you, Mr. Frank, for being here. Please proceed when you're ready.
The public debt starts on page 1. It has our traditional chart that shows the spending in the year that was, the year that is, and the year that will be. What's interesting about this chart is the striped line at the top of the chart. That's a $219 million deficiency appropriation. The reason that this is needed, and it'll talk about it more in a little bit, is there was a situation where I guess what happened was the legislature and the administration both assumed that bond premiums would be sufficient to support part of the capital program. The higher debt, or interest rates I should say, means that the premiums didn't materialize, and so there's a hole in this program, and this appropriation will fill that hole so that the projects that were authorized can actually move forward. On page 4 is a discussion of why we need this $219 million. The Exhibit 1 is a good example of the inverse relationship between the interest rates and the value of bonds. This is an exhibit actually that was in the Spending Affordability Committee presentation, and it's been used a few times. So what this does is it shows that in the 2020 and 2021, the bond sales, there was a low interest rate, and so we got large premiums. This flipped on its head in 2022, and so you can see as the interest rates increased, the premiums declined. And so the page 5 has Exhibit 2. What this shows is what is the spent on debt service this year. As you can see, there's a 30% is interest and the other 70% is principal. The reason for this is the state's debt is limited to 15 years, which is a fairly short maturity. The average maturity is 10 years. As such, we pay our debt off more quickly and we pay less interest. There's some states, it's common to have 30-year bonds. I calculated this, and if we had 30-year bonds, it would be more of a 50-50 ratio, where half of the money would be going to principal and the other half would be going to interest. On page 6 in Exhibit 3 is what shows as the debt service cost. This is what we're going to pay next year. As you can see, 97% of the debt service for next year are bonds that have already been issued. So this is a budget that doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in it. It's 97% already pretty much written in stone. What you see on the below there, what will be issued is the winter sale. That's the one, I believe March 15th is the date of that sale. And then there's the summer sale is assumed. The summer sale only has one debt service payment. That's why the interest payment is lower there. Also, the estimate that I made assumed a $550 million issuance this March. It turns out that that's a little high, so it's about up to 500 million, I believe, is what the treasurer is going with now. So what'll probably happen is these debt service costs are probably going to be a little bit less, but not by much, since 97% has already been issued. Page 7, Exhibit number 4, shows how we pay for the debt service. This is the annuity bond fund. So you can see we expect $978 million in state property tax revenues, which is the primary source for this fund. What you don't pay in property taxes is the policy is to then provide a general fund subsidy for it. As you can see at the bottom, based on the assumptions that we have, I expect about a $2 million balance at the end of the year. This may be a little bit bigger. One thing I will do on March 15th is prepare a report on the bond sale to tell you all what the debt service costs will be for the budget for fiscal 2024, and I will, so that the legislature knows about that. If you're going to pay most of your debt service costs with property taxes, you should probably have an idea of what's going on in housing markets. And so on page 8, Exhibit number 5, this shows the inventory and average or median home prices in Maryland since 2005. Now this is It's a 12-year moving, or excuse me, 12-month moving average. And the reason it's a moving average is this is a very volatile market, and so the line looks pretty messy. And so really what this measures is for 1 year, what's the year-on-year change? And as you can see from this, it's interesting, about 2008 is when state property taxes peaked from the housing bubble. Then they declined, and they've been increasing steadily, and lo and behold, since the pandemic, as everyone knows, they've been increasing more. Now, the trend, though, is slowing as far as the year-on-year change, and so we may be in a place where the trend changes again. Also, Exhibit 6 on page 9, this shows the relationship between the home values and as a penny per property tax. So basically, for every penny of property tax, what we do is you used to get about $40 million back in 2005. That peaked at $70 million in 2011, declined, and now it's back up to higher than it was. What's interesting about this is, in the last exhibit I mentioned that home values peaked in 2008, yet the property taxes peaked 3 years later, which is curious, but there is an explanation for that. The explanation is in the dotted line. For the first part, I should say, is in the dotted line. What happens in Maryland is property tax increases are capped. So if at 10% in Maryland per year. So if you are your home is appreciating more than 10%, you only pay up to that 10%, and you get a homestead tax credit. What happened during the housing bubble is that homestead tax credit ballooned, and so once the prices declined, the first thing to be reduced was the credit, not the state's property tax, because essentially people were, if you will, underpaying their taxes based on the rate because of this credit. As a forecaster that looks at this, I find this as a wonderful, wonderful idea, because I don't have to worry that if the housing bubble bursts, we're all of a sudden have to explain to you why we need $70 million or something like that. So this has its advantages both for the homeowners and for the state, in that it makes for a more stable revenue base. A second factor, which is less of an issue, but may be more of an issue in this year, is that there's also a 3-year phase-in of the assessment. So say if your home appreciates 9%, it's 3%, 6%, 9%. And so that also eases in and eases it into it, and that's another kind of a break on the increases, which, if the values then go down again, it makes for a more stable revenue source. On page 10 in exhibit number 7, I show what the debt service costs are going to be in the out years, and what we expect the state property tax revenues to be. These are the revenue out years are a little bit more modest than they were a year ago, because we think there's a little bit of a slowdown happening right now in real estate, and so it's best to be cautious. And then on page 11 in exhibit number 8, I put it all together as to what the out-year forecast is. This is going to be used also in the general fund forecast for Maryland. And as you can see, about from $400 to $500 million is the expected general fund payments. There's also the capital authorizations, $260 million. That the $219 million fills that hole there. That if we don't get it, and that's shown in this exhibit as well. All right, page 12. The first issue. This is an issue about how we ought to think about issuing our bonds. When we issue bonds, what we do is the bonds are sold at par value, which is $5,000, and there's a coupon rate, which has been 5% in recent years. So for each bond, you would get a $125 interest payment every 6 months, and then at the end, you get a $5,000 principal payment to return your principal with your last interest payment. Now, that's how the state has structured the bonds. The underwriters who bid on the bonds and then sell them in the secondary market, we allow them to structure theirs any way they want to. And in recent years, there's been an advantage, essentially, because the interest rates have been below 5%, to bid up the value of these bonds to say if the market rate is 3%, then you would bid the prices up to, say, between $6,000 and $7,000 per bond. Now, the interest payment you'll make is still going to be the same as you're making, but what you're as the market rate would be. But what you're doing is you're changing your cash flows so that you pay more now and you get more interest or larger payments in the debt service later. The advantage of this is that it protects the value of your bonds if interest rates were to rise. And because interest rates were so low, many investors wanted to protect the value of this fixed rate payment, and so bonds were sold what's called at a premium, with that additional amount above par. Say if it's $6,000, that $1,000 above the $5,000 is what would be called the premium. All right, so what I do every summer is I do a regression analysis to see what kind of factors influence our interest rates for these bonds. And in the last one of the things I looked at is the policy has been since 2020 to have a 5% ceiling and a 5% floor on what the coupon rate will be. In past years, there would be more flexibility, so that if the underwriters wanted to sell the bonds at a 4% coupon, they could. But it's been 5%. What I found is that actually increases what's the true interest cost, which is the internal rate of return of these bonds. And so that made me wonder: is setting it at 5% the ideal policy in all situations? Now, offsetting this to complicate things is that we sell callable bonds. So what that means, and the call is 10 years, what that means is that after 10 years, the state could call back the bonds, they would pay off the principal, and then if the interest rate is lower than, say, the 5% coupon, issue new bonds at a lower interest rate and get those savings. The state has done that quite a bit in recent years, less so since the tax changes eliminated advance refunding. But this is a strategy the state has used. The point I bring this up because this call is an option and it is worth something. And one of the factors that influences how much this call is worth is what this coupon rate is. So the higher the coupon rate, the higher is the value of the option and the more potential savings you have in the out years. So the real question I'm asking is, on the one hand, we're definitely paying more in order to have these higher coupon rates on the interest rate. However, are we paying too much that we are overpaying for this call option that we have on our bonds? That's the question, that's the trade-off. This is probably something that needs to be evaluated with every bond sale, because there are advantages to higher coupon rates, but on the other hand, you can also overpay. And so my recommendation to the Treasurer's office is that they take a look at this periodically and come up with their financial advisor what the best strategy is for these bonds. On page 13 is the second issue, and this has to do with affordability. There is an affordability process that Maryland has and adheres to. There are two criterion. The first is that debt service cannot exceed 8% of the revenue supporting the debt service, and the second is that state debt outstanding cannot exceed 4% of state personal income. And so I take a look at Exhibit 9 on page 14, and that shows our debt service to revenues affordability ratio. It's clearly is well below the 8%, and so we're quite comfortably below that right now. Similarly, on page 15, Exhibit 10, once again, we are even low here. We're even further below and have more capacity, and part of that has to do with, as I mentioned earlier, that the 15-year limit on the bonds. So it's kind of like if you have a 15-year versus a 30-year mortgage, one of them gets paid off faster, and here we're paying this off faster. And so it really, and it's been 3 decades since we've been anywhere near the limit on this. Also, implicit in all of the work that I've done so far is that I'm using the the CIP that the administration uses as what the authorizations and the capital program will be. The Spending Affordability Committee recommended a higher amount of authorizations. And what page 16, Exhibit 11 does is it shows you what that rate is. Now, I also calculated the affordability ratios for those, and that was affordable, very comfortably affordable as well, but I think you've seen enough of that exhibit, so I'm not going to give you two more. Okay. Third issue has to do with how the state manages its debt effectively. And one thing we look at here is we'll start with, is Maryland a high debt, a low debt, or an average debt state? Well, if you go to page 17, Exhibit 12, Moody's Investor Services, what they do is every year they compare all the state debt. And this is the most recent, it's from fiscal 2021, and this compares tax-supported debt outstanding to personal income. And as you can see, Maryland is 13th among all states, and what I put on this chart are the AAA-rated states, which we think of as our peer group since we are a AAA-rated state. And we're second highest among the AAA-rated states. Now, I would add this, that Moody's considers lottery bonds to also be state debt in their calculation, and we do not. And since it's Friday, I won't go into a conversation about that, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to answer questions about why that would be. Page 18, Exhibit 13, similar situation this is net debt service to revenues. In this case, Maryland is 9th among all states and has the highest debt service to revenue among the AAA-rated states. I will point out here that the issue I brought up earlier about that you pay more debt service interest costs if you have longer bonds, and so there's kind of. So this kind of an approach would penalize states with shorter maturities, like Maryland does. And so to equalize this, what Moody's does is they recalculate all of the amortization tables and assume that everyone pays bonds out in 20 years, so that there's an apples-to-apples comparison, so that if you compare, say, Maryland with short maturities to a state with long maturities, Maryland isn't penalized. And finally, page 14, Exhibit 19, this is kind of their total liabilities comparison. And what this does, it obviously would have debt outstanding, but it also includes the unfunded pension liability, unfunded OPEB liabilities, and there's a few other smaller things that it includes, but it does include also deferred maintenance. It's because they look at it, what's the total picture of costs that Maryland would have to pay? And here, once again, Maryland is higher than our peer and among the highest states. Also, they do, similarly with the pension, they use the same discount rate for all of the pension funds, because one of the issues when you compare pension funds is if you use a different discount rate, then you can make your pension look either better or worse compared to others. And so once again, so there's an apples-to-apples comparison. They do adjust for that. And so the next question, obviously, is what does Maryland do with this large capital program that we have? And page 20, Exhibit 15, shows what it is. And to no one's, I would imagine no one's surprise in this room, 50% of the state capital budget is for non-state projects. It's for school construction and those kinds of things. And so we have a larger capital project program because we spend more on non-state. So also I want to point out on page 21, the state has authorized new issuances since 2019. And I'm not going to go through this whole list, but here's my list of the things that were authorized. And most of these are through the Stadium Authority. Okay. So after all that is said, Maryland is a high debt state. How comfortable, how well below or above the average interest rates do we pay? And 22, top of page 2, has some information about that. When I mentioned that to do the regression analysis to compare the factors, what I use is the Moody's Bond Buyer Index to compare them as kind of the basic index for what is happening with the market. And Maryland's is about 88% of that index. So we are 12% lower than this market index is. Also, what I've noticed is there's something I call the flight to quality since the Great Recession, in that higher rated debt has performed better since about 2008 than less higher rated debt. So they call that basically a flight to quality. If you're more concerned about protecting the value of the assets that you have, you move in to safer assets, and you are willing to pay a little extra for that. And so we also, or in this case, receive less less compensation for that. So definitely our debt is quite well and quite affordable from what we pay standpoint. Also, there are some credit strengths that our state has that are identified by all the rating agencies. Probably none of this is going to be a surprise to anyone. High wealth and income levels compared to the other states, a broad, diverse economy. Here's a key. The next one is key, and I'll talk more about that, is they call it strong and well-embedded financial practices. And that is the affordability process, and the fact that we live by the affordability process. So after reviewing that, I came up with some observations. And first of all, AAA rated states tend to have lower than average debt, not higher than average, but we're a little different. There are a few that are higher, but most of them are not. Like I said, the affordability process is a credit strength. This is something that, if you go back, I remember in the aftermath of the Great Recession, about almost $300 million was taken out of the capital program because we were concerned about breaching the debt affordability ratios. Also, there's a process for reducing the state budget during the year through the Board of Public Works, which the state has used before too. And so we have a process that adjusts quickly, and we have a long-term view of our affordability. And finally, a point I would make is that process matters more for a high debt state than it does for a low debt state. There's less risk involved if you don't have much debt out there. But so I encourage the state to continue its affordability process, and it actually is, because it's a pretty robust process too. And when administrations change, you really don't notice that much when we talk to rating agencies and meet, because everybody kind of comes to terms with this and says, hey, we got to, there's sometimes differences about how much we ought to issue each year, but it's all within this process. Nobody suggests that we blow up the process for whatever reason, but the disagreements that I've seen are within this process. So we do, at the end, I'll start with two more thoughts for the new treasurer and the new administration. The first, these are process related, and first is that basically when we look at, do we want to increase our authorizations, what we do is we just compare the cash flows of what that would be. It's common in other places to do what's called maximum debt service. That is, you look at your total cash flows and you see what's the highest number and say the true cost is the highest number. And there's two reasons that in Maryland I would suggest doing this, because the cash flows understate the value of the debt. The first is that we don't pay any principal in the first 2 years. It's an interest-only payment. So the first 2 payments are very small, and the other 13 are much larger. So if you issue debt, you really don't pay much until the 3rd year. A second thing to consider, a reason for this, I guess, is that the capital projects are funded on a cash flow basis. And so when you authorize something, that money doesn't get issued right away. It gets issued when, if you will, the bill is due for that project. And there are arbitrage and federal tax, penalty reasons to do that. So, because sometimes people suggest, why don't we just issue massive amounts of debt? But the federal government would would notice, and there could be some potential arbitrage rebates and things like that if we did that. And so what the state does is it pays debt service, or excuse me, issues the bills when the money is needed, and the estimate is about 31% of an authorization is issued in the first year, and it takes 5 years to issue all of it. So taking all this together, it usually takes about 7 or 8 years for to get to that maximum debt service, and then for many years you'd be paying that. And so the recommendation here is to consider maximum debt service when considering increasing authorizations. A second point, and this will be the last thing I'll make today, and it's on page 25, Exhibit 16. One of the concerns is, if you look at these affordability ratios, they assume that the economy is going to grow. And in this case, if you start with the 2023 total revenues, which is almost $30 billion, they're supposed to grow 3.7% a year, or 3.7% squared, and that'll get you to $32 million. And that's where we expect to be based on the latest estimates. However, if growth slows to only 2%, then you only get about $31 million 2 years out, and that would knock 0.21% or basis points off of the affordability ratios. No growth is about 0.48%. 2% decrease, like say a recession, would be 0.62, and 0.76 is for 4% decrease. And that's kind of similar to what the Great Recession was in 2008. The reason I point this out, another thing to consider with the affordability ratios, and this is, the other places have this too, is to have a target. If 8% is our limit, to have a target that is below that. And what happens is, if you get to the target, then you slowly make adjustments. So you're not in the position that the state was in 2010, when you have to take, a few $100 million out of the capital program. And the idea is to ease into this more, and to provide a cushion for more stability. And with that, I will go to page 26. The recommendation is to concur with the governor's allowance. And one last point I want to make, Appendix 1 on page 27, it shows what the 10-year U.S. Treasury note rates have been since over the last 60 years, essentially. And just to give some perspective of really what's amazing is how low interest rates really were during the pandemic. I mean, they really were historically low. And even at 4%, there's plenty of periods in which it's been more. So the interest rates are definitely higher. Probably won't get back as low as they were, but they're still quite affordable. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and take questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for the analysis on public debt. Are there any questions from members of the Appropriations Committee for Mr. Frank? Delegate Watson.
Frank, that was really a comprehensive analysis, and I appreciate everything you're trying to teach us. And I just have a quick question about, and maybe this treasurer can answer this better, I don't know, but I thought I'd start with you. Regarding that coupon rate of 5%, who makes that policy?
Before every bond sale, there's something called a preliminary official statement, which is 100 and some pages long, which is kind of, it also, part of what it does is outline the rules of the sale and how it could be structured. So that 5% coupon is in the preliminary official statement, and the treasurer's office would be the one.
Okay, so the treasurer's office is responsible for that policy?
Yes.
Okay.
Just to be fair, there is an advantage to that.
Yes.
But I don't want to come across too hard on this, but
I'm sure there is. I just wanted to understand whether we had anything to do with it. We don't. It's the treasurer's office.
Indeed,
unilaterally,
yes.
Right? Okay. And then do the bond rating agencies look at that type of policy in their evaluation of their rating for the state?
I haven't seen evidence that they do. My sense is that is a bit of a micro policy, right, of how and that they would, I would imagine, if something really bizarre were done, they would notice it. But I don't think this isn't in that kind of class.
Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Frank? Thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for being here. Today we have the honor of having the Treasurer for the State of Maryland, Treasurer Davis. Thank you very much, Treasurer Davis, for being here.
Good evening. Good afternoon. We're not there yet. Good afternoon, Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the committee. It's tempting to get up here and just go me too. As Delegate Watts noticed, that was quite a comprehensive analysis, excuse me, of our agency, and I want to certainly thank him for all of his work in that regard. To my left is my Chief Deputy Treasurer, John Martin. Some of you may know him from his prior positions. Let me start by saying that we concur with the DLS recommendation for the governor's allowance for public debt. You have my written testimony that addresses some of what was stated. I would just, excuse me, I just want to back up to address just a couple of things that were stated as it relates to the state's credit strength, which has helped Maryland maintain its AAA bond rating. We do have a March 15th bond sale coming up. As a matter of fact, we will be at, maybe it was stated earlier, we will be meeting with the bond rating agencies, myself, the Secretary of the Department of Budget Management, and the Comptroller Wednesday, we will be meeting with all three at different times. So we are in the process of preparing for that. We, one of the things I've had extensive conversations with them, and it was alluded to earlier. Yes, we are a high debt state, and that's something that they do routinely express concerns to us. But as I think I've stated to you before, they are very impressed with our management policies that the General Assembly, the Governor, and the Treasurer's Office have in place. Things, again, such as the Capital Debt Affordability Committee, the Spending Affordability Committee, et cetera. So they are very, that helps to mitigate some of their concern. And they do recognize that while we are higher than most in debt, there are reasons for that. We contribute more towards the public school systems than most states. We take on a larger share of that, and we also we have a generous pension package, for post-employment or retirees. So that accounts for that. But as I stated, they are very complimentary towards our management practices, and while they will raise issues with me from time to time, I ask them simply, are you worried about Maryland and its ability to pay its bills? And they back off and go, no. So, we'll go, we will do with that. The coupon rate that was mentioned earlier, that's not something, while the office sets it, that's not something we do in a vacuum. Our financial advisors, they have recommended that. We're certainly going to take Mr. Frank's recommendations to heart and go back over it with our advisors and just, again, just sort of reaffirm if this is the correct policy for us. We've been told that Maryland's bonds and those that have that coupon rate of 5% are very attractive to investors, and that's one of the things. We have plenty of interest in our bonds, and that's one of the reasons why. But we will definitely go back and ask, is this still the correct rate that we're setting? And I think it's a good idea, before we do each of our bond sales to go back and reevaluate that policy. I have no problem with that. Again, we concur with the DLS recommendation for the governor's allowance, and with that, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions that we can answer, we'd be happy to do so at this time.
Thank you very much, Treasurer Davis, for your presentation. Are there any questions for Treasurer Davis? Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You all as well.
Next, we'll have the State Reserve Fund presented by Rebecca Ruff. Ms. Ruff, thank you for being here. Please proceed when you're ready.
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Ruff. I'm with the Department of Legislative Services, here to present the fiscal 2024 operating budget analysis for the State Reserve Fund. There are several accounts within the State Reserve Fund which provide the opportunity for the state to designate money for future use. So essentially, it's the equivalent of the state's savings account. The specific accounts within the State Reserve Fund that are touched in this analysis are the Rainy Day Fund, the Dedicated Purpose Account, and the Catastrophic Event Account. There is another account that falls under the budget code for the State Reserve Fund. It's referred to as the Sunny Day Fund. However, that is addressed in the Department of Commerce analysis. If you look on page 1 of the analysis, you'll see that funding dedicated to the State Reserve Fund decreases by about 63% to $1.6 billion in fiscal 2024. This consists of just over $1 billion appropriated to the Rainy Day Fund in accordance with statute, and about $543 million appropriated to the Dedicated Purpose Account. However, I would note that under the governor's fiscal 2024 budget plan, the $1 billion that is appropriated to the Rainy Day Fund is actually redirected in other ways, which we will get to in just a moment. Appendix 1 in the analysis, which is on page 14, does provide more specific detail about the activities that have been occurring within each of the 3 accounts for the last fiscal 2022 through 2024. But if you look at Exhibit 1 on page 3, you'll see that the very final bar in this chart represents the fiscal 2024 fund balance after the governor's proposed actions. This is about $2.5 billion and does equate to 10% of general fund revenues, which when you look at this chart and the history that's shown here, you can see that it is comparatively pretty high in comparison to the balance that's been kept in the account. On Exhibit 2, on page 4, this provides an explanation of what the governor's plan is for the Rainy Day Fund in the fiscal 2024 budget. You can see that the balance for fiscal 2023, the bar all the way to the left, we're expecting a balance at the close of the current fiscal year of just under $3 billion. And the statutory appropriation is about $1,061 million, which would mean that if the appropriation were to be made in accordance with statute, we would have a rainy day fund at the close of fiscal 2024 that would equate to about $4.1 billion, which would equal about 16% of general fund revenues. However, you can see through the actions that are outlined in red, this is what the governor is instead proposing to do with the statutory appropriation through the use of a BRFA, which would eliminate the required appropriation for fiscal 2024 only. There is language in the budget bill that indicates that $500 million of the appropriation would be directed to the Blueprint Fund to offset future implementation costs associated with the implementation of the blueprint. There's $500 million proposed to be transferred to the Dedicated Purpose Account for future capital transportation costs. There is also a $61 million proposed contingent reduction, which is the remaining balance of the appropriation. You'll see when we get to the recommended actions that DLS is actually recommending that you take this reduction directly, which would then allow you to be able to reappropriate those funds for whatever priorities the legislature identifies. And then also to get down to that 10% balance, or $2.5 billion for fiscal 2024, the governor's budget plan does include transferring $479 million from rainy day fund balance to the general fund to help support the operating costs identified in the governor's budget. On page 5, Exhibit 3 outlines the $543 million in appropriation to the Dedicated Purpose Account by the specific purposes for fiscal 2024. Several of these items are either annual or have been funded in recent prior years. There is the $167 million to support the capital grant for WMATA. There is $152 million provided to support cybersecurity. This is in accordance with legislation that was passed last session that required a minimum appropriation of at least the equivalent of 20% of IT spending in fiscal 2023 be appropriated to support cybersecurity spending in fiscal 2024. There are the standard OPEB and pension sweepers, although it's worth noting that the pension sweeper is $10 million less than what is typically appropriated for this, assuming revenues are available. And that's because there was legislation that did a one-time redirection of $10 million for this sweeper to the Maryland Equity Investment Fund. There's $10 million, again, appropriated for food banks. This is consistent with the amount that was provided in the fiscal 2023 budget in the dedicated purpose account for distribution to the food banks. This funding, although it was anticipated to be one-time in last year's budget, the administration decided to include the funds for another year due to high inflation costs and the fact that the food banks are seeing their federal funds that they'd previously been relying on going away. There's $6.3 million in PAYGO funds to meet what is anticipated to be the state's required 35% match for the new veterans home. There was $63.3 million provided in last year's budget for this project, but due to escalation costs consistent with what we're seeing across Capitol, there's an additional $6.3 million that's needed in order to maintain that 35% match. And then there is $167.7 million in what we are referring to as new or one-time funding that's being appropriated to the dedicated purpose account. This does include $150 million in funding that the administration has set aside to cover legislative priorities. You'll see in the recommended actions that DLS is recommending that you make a reduction to these funds, which would then allow you to be able to directly appropriate the funds to the specific purposes and priorities that you would like to see funded. There's $10 million appropriated to cover the payback of unfunded liabilities to the local income tax reserve account. DLS is also recommending that these funds can be reduced, and that's because the statute requiring the repayment of this unfunded liability actually dictates a direct revenue distribution rather than a required appropriation. And the Board of Revenue Estimates has confirmed that that distribution is accounted for in their revenue estimates, and so therefore this appropriation is not required. And then finally, there's $7.7 million appropriated to cover awards to erroneously confined individuals. This is a topic that is covered in greater depth in the Board of Public Works analysis, but basically there's about $7.7 million in awards. These are often multi-year awards, and so these reflect the funds that the state is aware has already been committed to individuals who are receiving these awards, and so this is kind of a good government measure to make sure that those funds are in fact set aside to comply with what the state is required to provide those individuals. There is one key observation that begins on page 8 of the analysis, and it really is just providing you with a little bit of an update on the $800 million in prior year appropriations to the dedicated purpose account that still remain in the account. Increased utilization of the dedicated purpose account has been growing over the last few years as we've seen significantly higher cash balances available for appropriation and for a variety of purposes. If you look at Exhibit 4, you can see how the increase has occurred since fiscal 2021. In total, there's been over $3.3 billion appropriated between fiscal 2021 and 2024 to the dedicated purpose account. About $2 billion has been transferred out of the dedicated purpose account to the respective state agencies assigned to implement the variety of purposes that these funds are supporting. And that leaves a balance of about $801.8 million remaining in the account, exclusive of the $543 million that's proposed to be appropriated in the fiscal 2024 allowance. Exhibit 5 on page 9 provides you with the detail of what those remaining appropriations include. There is $160 million remaining from the $210 million appropriated to support cybersecurity. That's worth noting that there is currently a $94 million budget amendment that is pending that the administration has submitted. The majority of these funds have gone either to MDH or to Do It, and I believe the $94 million is I think almost entirely intended to be directed to Do It, to continue to implement a variety of cybersecurity measures. Cybersecurity is an issue that is covered extensively in the Department of Information and Technology analysis, so you can look there for more information about that. There is $47.3 million remaining for of the $50 million appropriated for the state center relocation. To date, most of the funds have been used and directed to do some initial outfitting of IT infrastructure for when the moves happen mid-year 2023. I would note that I believe nearly all the agencies do have lease agreements in place, so we would expect to see these funds starting to transfer out as we progress through the rest of this calendar year. There's the funds for the new Veterans Home PAYGO that I already discussed. There was $200 million appropriated for facility renewal for both state agencies, the parks, and higher education. To date, $11 million has been transferred out. This is all specific to higher education projects. Of the $800 million in PAYGO legislative priorities that were identified in the fiscal 2023 budget, nearly all of the funds have been transferred out except for $123 million. DBM indicated with the very first budget amendment transferring funds out that they intended to release these funds on a cash flow basis. So as projects needed the funds, they would submit another amendment to transfer them out. So this is largely reflective of the cash flow demands for the identified projects. And then there's about $48 million in remaining funds that were set aside for operating-based legislative priorities. This includes $20 million for apprenticeships. There was a $5 million budget amendment that was submitted towards the end of calendar 2022, which identified funding priorities related to apprenticeships within the Department of Labor. Recognizing that there is significant legislative interest in funding apprenticeships, I believe there is work between the administration and the legislature in terms of exactly how the full amount of apprenticeship funding will be utilized. But there was $25 million appropriated in last year's budget for that. There's $20 million remaining in the account related to the autism waiver. This was a total of $30 million that was appropriated to increase the autism waiver slots by 1,500 slots. In accordance with the budget language in the fiscal 2023 budget, $10 million was transferred to MSDE with the start of fiscal 2023. Those funds have yet to be spent. There's been a longer lead time required in order to receive the necessary approvals from the federal government to be authorized for the additional slots. However, MSDE did submit a report indicating that they, while they don't believe they'll be able to spend the $10 million in fiscal 2023, they do anticipate being able to spend nearly $26 million of the $30 million in fiscal 2024, with the remainder of the funds to be spent in fiscal 2025. And finally, there's $8 million that was set aside for a unified financial aid system. This is the full amount of funds that was appropriated to the DPA for this purpose. It's my understanding that the development of this IT project is underway for fiscal 2024. They're expecting it to not be completed until 2026. The total project cost is currently estimated to be about $20.7 million, so this does reflect only a portion of the required funding for that project. Finally, there's federal funds that were appropriated with relation to broadband. We are expecting that these funds will move out sometime over the course of this calendar year. They're still in the process of developing the maps and different guidelines with regard to the implementation of the broadband. So my understanding is they haven't been needed to date, but we do expect to see a budget amendment related to these funds shortly. With that, the recommended actions for the reserve fund analysis are found on page 12. Items 1 and 2 are related. This is the previously referred to direct reduction of the $61.4 million contingent appropriate, what the administration is proposing to be a contingent reduction. We are instead recommending that you reduce those funds directly so that they can then be considered for reappropriation. And item 1 is just the technical action to strike the contingent language. Items 3, 4, and 5 are also related. Items 4 and 5 are the recommendation to reduce the $150 million that's been set aside for legislative priorities and the $10 million that isn't actually needed in order to cover the payback of the local income tax reserve account unfunded liability. And item 3 is the technical action that would strike those specific line item appropriations from the dedicated purpose account appropriation. With that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruff, for your presentation. We have a question from Delegate Corman.
Here, Rebecca. So, can you explain the local income tax change, the local income tax reserve account change, what they put in the budget and what you're recommending? Just
Sure.
more slowly for me.
Sure. So there's the local income tax reserve account, and before I was responsible for this analysis, the state in tougher budget times borrowed against the account. And so there are unfunded liabilities, but obviously it looks better if we have a plan for repaying the unfunded liability, right? So there was a requirement to pay it back through $33.3 million appropriations. And the first year for that would have been the 2020 session. And instead, you might recall that session, it was pretty memorable, I think, for everybody that was here. We weren't quite sure what the budget situation would be, so instead, that appropriation, there was a BRFA that year. And so it was modified, that instead of making $33.3 million appropriated payments, the repayment of the unfunded liability would be extended for a longer time period, and it would instead be $10 million direct revenue distributions. So the revenues are directly transferred by the comptroller to the account, and so therefore it never needs to be a budgeted appropriation. However, there was misunderstanding, and so in order to, the administration thought they needed an appropriation in order to meet the requirement. But if these funds were to remain in the budget, it would actually be doubling.
Got it. So the comptroller just sort of takes off the top as revenue comes in, the 10 million, and puts it in the right account. We don't have to take any action because it's in the statute through
Correct.
BRFA.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. God, old times. Old times.
Thank you very much, Delegate Corman. Delegate Watson.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I just had a question about the recommendation on page 6 about the one-time appropriations from the DPA fund, the dedicated purpose account. So I think I see where you are recommending that we reduce on page 12. I'm just trying to transfer page 6 to page 12, 150 million to the general fund account, which is the money that the governor set aside. So, but as part of that, you also mentioned 17.7 million. That makes up the total of 167.7 million. Am I reading that or understanding that right?
The other 17.7 million, so the 167.7 is the combination of the 3 items under new or one time in Exhibit 3 on page 5. So it's 150 million for legislative priorities.
Wait. Exhibit 3 on page 5, okay. Got it. Go ahead, sorry.
The 150 million for legislative priorities.
Right.
The 10 million for the local income tax reserve account. Those are the 2 items that
Right.
we're recommending cutting.
All right, so you're recommending cutting them, right?
Correct.
Okay, so why isn't that on page 12? Or
It-
is it on page 12?
It is on page 12. Item 4 at the bottom of page 12 is the reduction of the 150 million.
Right.
And item 5 on page 13 is the reduction of the 10 million.
Okay, but where's the 7.7?
We're not recommending cutting the 7.7. That is funds for awards to erroneously convicted individuals, and
Got
so we approve that appropriation.
Okay, got it. And then last question is, the money that you are recommending be cut on pages 12 and 13, that theoretically can be used for either operating or capital?
Yes, so the budget bill, if you look at item number 3, this is, our recommendation is to strike the specific language in the budget bill that relates to these items. So that you could see from that the governor's budget actually identifies specifically $50 million for operating priorities
Right.
and $100 million for PAYGO. However, it's all cash.
Right.
And so once it's cut, it can be appropriated for
Right.
either purpose.
So the legislature can determine whether they want it
Correct.
in either budget.
Yes.
Thank you. Your presentation was really fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Watson. Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Ruff on the presentation? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have with us today the Department of Budget and Management Secretary, Secretary Helene Grady. Thank you very much, Secretary Grady, for being here.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name's Helene Grady. I'm the Acting Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management, and I have with me Mark Nicole, our Deputy Secretary for Budget and Management. We want to thank Ms. Ruff for her analysis. As noted in the analysis, in light of current economic uncertainty, the Moore administration has budgeted to maintain the rainy day fund at the state's target of $2.5 billion, or 10% of general fund revenue in fiscal year '24. The administration and DBM look forward to working together with the General Assembly to ensure that Maryland remains on a fiscally responsible, sustainable path forward that best serves Marylanders now and in the future. DBM concurs with the recommendations of DLS. With that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Secretary Grady. Are there any questions for Secretary Grady? Seeing none? That's it. Thank you. Thank you for being here. On behalf of Chair Barnes, thank you everyone for being part of today's budget hearing, and have a great weekend.